I don't know if you guys can smell me from way over there. The Panda Express worker and the Sbarro worker are ignoring all this completely. Mark, we, the imaginary intern and I, used to talk a lot about an olfactory art, some kind of post-linguistic, pheromonal medium that would be infinitely more nuanced than language, and without language's representational deficiencies. A purely molecular syntax freed from all the associative patterns and encoded ideological biases of language that could produce the revelatory sensations of art by exciting chemosensory neurons instead of the, quote, mind, end of quote, that could jettison all the incumbent imperial narratives and finally get to something really non-fictional. And we both tremendously admired Helen Keller's militantly pro-olfactory polemic, quote, smell the fallen angel, end of quote, in her book, The World I Live In. And we both agreed that if all the highly anticipated virtual and augmented reality technologies turn out to be just based on sight and sound, they'll be complete dead ends. And we both thought that diners, drive-ins, and dives, or Beat Bobby Flay, which are predicated upon olfaction and gustation, are more sophisticated shows epistemologically than, say, something like Bill Moyer's Journal or Charlie Rose, which are based on archaic discursive practices. And we both felt very strongly, for a completely different reason, basically because Balis scaris proxianus worms and Cystosoma mansoni flukes are infinitely more interesting characters than advertising executives or a police commissioner, that Monsters Inside Me, the Animal Planet documentary series about parasites, is a better show than probably anything else on television. Not sure about any of this, just throwing it out there. But this all seems to represent a fairly radical revision of Descartes, whose I think, therefore I am, becomes instead, I stink, therefore I think, right? There are smells that your own body produces that can have the same effect as Proust's Madeleine, producing that extraordinary, unbidden gust of remembrance, the mémoire involontaire. I once mentioned this in passing to the imaginary intern, adding that I was reluctant to talk about it because I thought people might think it's juvenile or gross, and he said, No, dude, you should absolutely talk about it. It's something so many people can identify with. Which is such a totally imaginary intern thing to say. By the way, he was so perspicacious about things like this, but without even the slightest bit of self-importance or pretension. I, on the other hand, have always been squeamish and neurotically reticent about things like this. But I do think it's particularly pertinent here. There's a certain bowel movement of mine, and it's not something I can reduplicate at will. I've yet to figure out what food or combination of foods actually produces it, whose smell immediately transports me back in time to a very specific men's room at the Deal Casino, a beach club in Deal, New Jersey, that my family frequented during summers when I was a little kid. This was a very lovely and carefree, very richly experienced, almost psychedelically vibrant time in my life. A time when I first saw zeppelins in the sky, first heard the sound of mahjong tiles being shuffled, first caught glimpses of naked Marlboro smoking middle-aged women in cabanas, etc. And that particular fecal smell and the memories it instantly evokes buoys me for hours and sometimes days on end, and it's something that probably got me through my almost unassuageable grief when the imaginary intern left. And I'd sit there on the toilet desperately hoping to reconjure his face from the configuration of cracks in the tile floor. I think I mentioned before all his elaborate variations on my own motifs. which seemed to me so much more brilliant than the original ideas. Well, after he suddenly left, which I'll talk about more in a minute, in my grief and my anguished disbelief, which almost immediately exposed long repressed memories of my dead sister and swelled into a pain of infinite yearning that's never quite abated, I ransacked the house in search of any remnants of him. And I found a trove of his quote-unquote poems, which were not originally intended as poems at all, I suppose, but were simply artless collations of my own fragmentary notes, but which have the numinous, elegiac, oracular quality, in my opinion at least, of the greatest poetry of, say, Friedrich Hölderlin or of Gerard de Nerval, whose disdain for the material world matched that of the imaginary intern. Quote, "This life is a hovel and a place of ill repute. I'm ashamed that God should see me here," end of quote. Who famously walked his pet lobster Thibault at the end of a blue silk ribbon through the gardens of the Palais Royal, and who hanged himself from a sewer grating in the Rue de la Vieux Lanterne with an apron string he believed to be the Queen of Sheba's garter. As the imaginary intern would say, you can't make this stuff up, which, come to think of it, is a sort of ironic thing for an imaginary intern to say. In a very literal sense, the imaginary intern existed for the project. He was all about the project. All about the production of Gone with the Mind. That was his sole remit, as they say. So thanks largely to him, everything we talked about, no matter how seemingly extraneous or irrelevant, Twizzlers commercials, the molecular basis of infrared detection by pit vipers, Betty Boop, Helen Keller, Jenna Jameson, parasitic worms, whatever, somehow or other wound its way back to our work. The only exception to this, the only thing we didn't treat in a utilitarian way, the only thing that was completely sacrosanct, was the epic, heroic role the Soviet Union played in the defeat of Nazi Germany in World War II, and, in particular, the defense of Stalingrad. One afternoon, I got back home from the gym, and he was gone. I found a note he'd left behind entitled, "Ciao." One just keeps saying, "No, no, no," head bowed, hat in hand. A cringing, cunning little step back with each dialectical evasion. Retreating, receding, no, 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 until one simply disappears. I missed so terribly working on Gone with the Mind with him. And I miss the times when we'd just sit around listening to music together in the dark, usually moody, British post-punk pop, or watching TV. Life's a harrowing fucking slog. We're driven by irrational, atavistic impulses into an unfathomable void of quantum indeterminacy. But still, it's nice to have a friend, a comrade, a paracosm, whatever, to share things with. The earliest folk tales tended to be about single-cell organisms which lived deep below the surface of the earth, where where temperatures routinely exceeded 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Soon, though, folk tales began to feature tiny, multicellular worms which had evolved to survive in the extreme, inhospitable conditions of the subsurface biosphere. These worms, belonging to, quote, the vast and diverse phylum of nematodes, end of quote, ate bacteria and often grew no bigger than 2/100ths of an inch. Then, for a very, very long period of time after this, almost all folk tales pivoted around a cobbler, his fat, conniving wife, and their gullible daughter. But the degree of refinement was extraordinarily high. Each ensuing folk tale an almost imperceptibly subtle modification of its predecessor. Today, these elegant algorithms have given way to autobiography, with the hope that it might carry the same breadth of allegorical signification. So, were I to say something like, and I'm just riffing here, I'm just freestyling, something like, I was a delicate little boy with flaxen bangs from Jersey City, who was alternately titillated and revolted by other children my age. Those filthy, cross-eyed children in jughead whoopee caps who'd run around screaming at the tops of their lungs with long, pink, round worms wriggling out of their nostrils. And my pretty young mother, she was so young then, in her pink Izod polo shirt and her short khaki wraparound skirt and her penny loafers, would prepare me a lunch of cream of mushroom soup with banana Turkish taffy for dessert, and she'd read aloud folk tales about other delicate little boys just like me, whose pretty mothers also read to them as they ate. Exertions which would leave her almost too exhausted to fend off the coarse advances of the stooped, hook-nosed peddlers and the sweaty merry-go-round operators who seem to be endlessly ringing our doorbell. Something like that. I think you could discern even something like that. Certain folkloric elements, certain of the generic narratives that the Soviet folklorist Vladimir Prop enumerated. And even though the lexicon, jughead, Turkish taffy, and the clothes, the Izod polo shirts, the penny loafers, clearly situates it in a very specific time, in a relatively contemporaneous reality, the early 60s, there's still, to my mind at least, an illud tempus, to borrow Iliad's phrase, suggested here. A kind of a vaguely medieval, once upon a timeness suggested by these roving peddlers and those caterwauling, parasite-infested children. We are, all of us, so deeply, so atavistically inculcated with the structures and the tropes that inhere in the very act of storytelling, that no sooner do we begin narrating our own presumably unprecedented childhoods than we, no matter who we are, reflexively conjure up the very same brigands and woodsmen, the very same vagabonds and troubadours and ogres, the very same hermits and sly anthropomorphic animals, or recognize their interchangeable avatars whom we have inescapably become through the telling and the retelling. And I think you're going to find in some of the excerpts I'm planning on reading tonight, and right now I can just pick arbitrarily a couple of lines off the top of my head. Lines like, quote, I was fascinated by the nuns who seemed to float across the boulevard on rainy afternoons, for instance, or I got my first hand job from a schizophrenic girl with webbed fingers, or even in a passing recollection like, and I don't remember the exact words off the top of my head here, something like, I'm pacing outside the club, smoking a cigarette. It's like mid-January and I'm fucking freezing in this filthy Tricks t-shirt. One of those little blue dental bibs with the metal ball chains, red plaid flannel pajama bottoms, with this giant hole in the crotch, and a pair of white clogs. And my father calls to tell me that he's surprised I hadn't been included in Philip Roth's list of formidable post-war writers, or even in a section that appears toward the very end of the autobiography where I say something like, I'm 58 years old, and I'd still rather try to support myself by mowing people's lawns and babysitting than by teaching. Or, and this is one of the last lines in the whole book, would it be so terrible for a man who perseveres under the Damoclean threat of cancer and the ever-present specter of assassination to simply try and have one last meal with his old mother in the food court of a mall? I think even in these lines you can find a sense of the fantastic, a sense of fairy tale enchantment. But that idea of enchantment, as we move through the second decade of the 21st century, seems ever more adulterated, ever more degraded. And one wonders, by what exactly? As chronologies of diagnosis and treatment replace the surrealist poetry of our symptomology, how quickly it can all begin to seem like a PowerPoint presentation at a TED Talk or the strobe effect of PTSD flashbacks in a Lifetime movie. Of course, the battle between the materialist rationalists and the anti-materialist irrationalists is long over, and the anti-materialist irrationalists lost, and we await our UFOs and our flying balconies to come and bear us away. The chorus in Seneca's Thyestes asks, will the last days come in our time? And I would say, yes, absolutely. I mean, the last days might very well come during this reading tonight. I think my mom mentioned before that the floodwaters are rising, right? And assassins, vengeful spirits, first-person shooters, mall shooters, whatever you want to call them, are all wandering around, floating around, and I don't think any of this should especially disturb anyone. I don't think it's anything to get all bummed out about. I think it should actually make everyone feel really good. Oprah said to Lindsay Lohan, vultures are waiting to pick your bones. That should liberate you. Someone in the video game Total War Shogun 2 says something to the effect of, a samurai should not scandalize his name by holding his one and only life too dear. In other words, the true samurai enters the battle with no thought of return, and I really think that's how you have to look at it when you do a nonfiction reading. When you really commit to only presenting empirically verifiable material, when you're really deadly serious about that. And I bring up the Japanese writer Yukio Mishima now, not because he was a sickly, pale, pampered introvert of a child who grew up to become obsessed with bodybuilding and who, as an adult, when his mother complained that Mommy's foot hurts, proceeded to lick the sore area in front of friends and family, but because he gave, on November 25th, 1970, one of the best nonfiction readings ever given when he stepped out onto a balcony, not the flying balcony of the Palazzo Venezia, but a balcony nonetheless, and declaimed a prepared manifesto to several hundred soldiers gathered below who mocked and jeered him, and who, by the way, weren't officially there for the reading either. Returned inside, disemboweled himself, and was then beheaded by a member of his private militia. I'm qualifying this by calling it one of the best nonfiction readings ever given. It could have been one of the great nonfiction readings ever given if Mishima's mother, Shizu Harioka, had been there. But she wasn't, although she did attend his funeral. I mean, you'd have to say, and I think this is so obvious given the fact that being mocked, jeered at, and martyred in the presence of one's mom is the key. The key ingredient here. That Christ on the cross, in the presence, of course, of his mother, the Virgin Mary, gave one of the greatest nonfiction readings ever given. Now, I just want to fast forward 6 hours or so in the gospel narrative to make a small point. The Virgin Mary was not a Ferbering mother. And though the lifeless body of Christ did not literally cry out for her, the exigencies of Christian doctrine surely did. And unlike my mom on those unfortunate nights alluded to earlier, Mary did respond. And unlike my mom, Mary cradled her son in her arms. And hence the enormously popular, endlessly reproduced, and invariably eroticized image of the Pieta. Now, in all fairness, we can't underestimate the influence on young mothers, and my mom was only, barely 20 at that time. We can't underestimate the enormous influence of pro-Ferbering authorities like Dr. Spock, who, when it came to children's sleep problems, and this may surprise you guys, was more draconian than even Ferber himself. The Panda Express worker and the Sbarro worker are paying absolutely no attention to anything Mark is saying.